The afternoon of August 24, 1942, 150 miles east of the Solomon Islands, aboard the USS Enterprise. The flight deck crew worked in desperate rhythm, launching fighters and bombers toward Japanese carriers somewhere beyond the horizon. The air smelled of aviation fuel and hot metal. Radio chatter crackled with fragmentary reports of enemy aircraft inbound. 75 miles away, closing fast. At 17:12 hours, the first Japanese dive bomber began its attack. Lieutenant Commander Elias Mott, the Enterprise's gunnery officer, watched the sky. The enemy planes were so high, so small, silhouetted against the late afternoon sun that his anti-aircraft crews couldn't see them properly. The blue of the sky made them nearly invisible. Then they started their dives. 30 Val dive bombers from the Japanese carrier Shokaku screaming down at the Big E from 14,000 feet. The sky erupted. 20mm guns, 40mm guns, 5-inch batteries from the Enterprise and the battleship North Carolina opened fire simultaneously. Japanese aircraft fell. 1, 2, 5, 10. But there were too many. At 17:14, a 250-kilogram bomb pierced the number 3 elevator. It punched through the flight deck and detonated 42 feet below, between the second and third decks. The blast killed 35 men instantly. 30 seconds later, a second bomb struck near the same elevator, detonating 8 feet below the flight deck. The deck buckled upward 18 inches. Fragments shredded arresting gear cables. Then came the third bomb. It hit at frame 127, 28 feet to starboard of the centerline. It exploded on contact, blowing a 10-foot hole in the flight deck. More men died. Fires ignited across 3 decks. For 60 seconds, it looked like the Enterprise was finished. The same kind of hits that had doomed 3 Japanese carriers at Midway just 10 weeks earlier. The same type of attack that would sink Japanese carriers again and again throughout the war. But something different happened aboard the Enterprise. Something the Japanese Navy had never quite understood, never quite replicated, even though they had studied American carrier designs, copied American engineering, built their own flat tops using lessons learned from the United States. The damage control parties were already moving. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This is the story of what Japan copied from America when they built their aircraft carriers, and what they forgot. It's the story of engineering versus training, of hardware versus culture, of ships that looked similar on the surface but survived damage in completely different ways. And at the center of it all is a single principle that the United States Navy had learned from the Imperial German Navy after World War I, had drilled into every sailor from boot camp forward, and had made the foundation of ship design itself. A principle so fundamental that its absence would cost Japan the Pacific War as surely as any battle. The principle was simple. Every man is a damage control man. Every sailor, regardless of rate or rank, was trained to fight fires, patch holes, shore bulkheads, and keep the ship afloat. It wasn't a specialty. It was basic seamanship. And when bombs started falling, when torpedoes struck home, when fuel lines ruptured and compartments flooded, that training made the difference between a ship that went to the bottom and a ship that fought on. The Japanese never learned this lesson. They built magnificent carriers. They trained superb pilots. They designed aircraft that could outfly and outfight anything America had in 1941. But they treated damage control as a technical problem to be solved by specialists, not a ship-wide responsibility requiring universal training. And ship after ship, battle after battle, that difference killed them. The story begins not with Pearl Harbor, not with Midway, but with Jutland. May 31st, 1916. The North Sea off the coast of Denmark. The German High Seas Fleet faced the British Grand Fleet in the largest naval battle of World War I. British battle cruisers exploded. The Indefatigable blew up at 16:02 hours. 1,015 men dead in seconds. The Queen Mary followed at 16:26. 1,266 men dead. The Invincible at 18:34. 1,026 dead. 3 ships, over 3,000 men, gone in flashes of fire and smoke when shells penetrated their magazines. The German ships took tremendous punishment but didn't explode. German battlecruiser Seydlitz took 22 large-caliber hits. She survived. Derfflinger took 21 hits. She survived. Lutzow took 24 hits. She sank, but hours later, giving her crew time to evacuate. The difference wasn't armor. The difference was damage control. German ships had better compartmentalization, better firefighting equipment, better training. More importantly, German doctrine emphasized that every man understood basic damage control. British ships relied on specialists. German ships trained everyone. After the war, American naval officers studied Jutland extensively. They read German damage control manuals. They interviewed German naval officers. They were so impressed that in the 1920s, the United States Navy issued translated copies of the German damage control regulations to American crews. The lesson was clear. Technical solutions alone wouldn't save ships. Training had to be universal. Organization had to be flexible. Every sailor had to understand how to keep his ship afloat. This philosophy shaped American carrier design from the beginning. When the Navy Department's Bureau of Construction and Repair issued specifications for building the USS Yorktown and USS Enterprise in February 1934, damage control wasn't an afterthought. It was foundational. The specifications included detailed requirements for watertight compartmentation, fire mains, pumping systems, emergency power, and repair equipment. But more importantly, they assumed that the crew would be trained to use all of it. When the Enterprise was commissioned on May 12, 1938, she carried more than just aircraft and weapons. She carried a damage control philosophy. 5 area-centric repair parties were established, each responsible for a specific section of the ship. One ship-wide repair party specialized in aviation gasoline fires. Each party could act independently if communications were severed. Each party was cross-trained. Engineering personnel knew firefighting. Deck division sailors understood flooding control. Electricians could shore damaged bulkheads. Aviation mechanics knew how to contain fuel spills. More critically, the training was continuous. At sea, the Enterprise's crew drilled damage control constantly. Simulated fires. Simulated flooding. Simulated casualties to vital systems. The drills weren't gentle. They were exhausting, repetitive, and conducted under conditions that approximated combat. Men learned to work in darkness, in smoke, in spaces filled with water, with communications cut, with simulated casualties reducing available manpower. They learned that the book answer might not work, that improvisation mattered, that keeping the ship afloat required everyone, not just specialists. This training filtered through every level of the Navy. Recruits at boot camp learned basic firefighting. Midshipmen at the Naval Academy studied damage control theory. The textbook used at Annapolis during the 1930s included this sentence: "A comprehensive understanding of the principles of damage control is an essential part of the training of the young, as well as the experienced, naval officer." Officer or enlisted, aviator or engineer, everyone learned the fundamentals. Because when battle came, there wouldn't be time to read manuals. Japan took a different path. The Imperial Japanese Navy studied American carriers carefully. When they designed Akagi and Kaga in the 1920s, they incorporated many American concepts. When they laid down Soryu and Hiryu in the 1930s, they studied the Yorktown class. When they designed Shokaku and Zuikaku, completed in 1941, they built ships that matched or exceeded American carriers in speed, aircraft capacity, and striking power. Japanese carriers were magnificent machines, sleek, fast, capable of launching devastating airstrikes. Their design philosophy emphasized offense. Get aircraft into the sky quickly. Strike first. Strike hard. Destroy the enemy before he can respond. But damage control received less emphasis. Japanese doctrine treated damage control as an engineering specialty. Damage control personnel were professionals, trained extensively in their specific roles. They knew their equipment. They understood firefighting theory, flooding control, structural repair. But they were specialists in a system that relied on specialization. The rest of the crew received basic training, but nothing approaching the intensive, repetitive drilling that American sailors endured. The assumption seemed to be that properly designed ships, properly handled, wouldn't need extraordinary damage control efforts. That offensive power would eliminate threats before they could inflict serious damage. That specialists could handle whatever damage occurred. This assumption shaped Japanese carrier operations. Japanese carriers kept their aircraft armed and fueled on the hangar deck, ready for rapid launch. This allowed them to launch strikes quickly, to respond to threats with minimal delay. But it also meant that bombs, torpedoes, and fuel sat together in enclosed spaces where a single penetrating hit could trigger catastrophic secondary explosions. American carriers had moved away from this practice after studying the Lexington disaster at Coral Sea, where aviation fuel vapors led to fatal explosions. The Americans had learned to purge fuel lines with carbon dioxide, to clear hangar decks before action, to separate explosives from fuel from aircraft. The Japanese had not made these changes. Japanese carrier ventilation systems presented another vulnerability. Because Japanese hangars were completely enclosed to maximize operational efficiency, mechanical ventilation was the only way to clear fouled air. But this created a problem if fuel vapors accumulated. Opening ventilation systems to clear vapors could spread those vapors to previously uncontaminated spaces. And if the ventilation system was damaged in action, the crew had no way to clear smoke or toxic fumes except by opening hatches manually, which compromised watertight integrity. It was an engineering solution that worked perfectly in peacetime but created cascading failures under combat damage. The Japanese anti-aircraft layout on carriers like Akagi revealed another design philosophy. The anti-aircraft guns were positioned low on the hull, mounted on the port and starboard sides about 20 feet below the flight deck. This meant that guns on each side could only fire at targets on the same side of the ship. Portside guns couldn't fire across the flight deck to engage aircraft attacking from starboard. Worse, the island superstructure blocked the forward firing arcs of the port battery. This left huge gaps in defensive coverage. American carriers mounted anti-aircraft weapons higher with better firing arcs, allowing for overlapping fields of fire. It was a small difference in layout that had enormous consequences when enemy dive bombers attacked from multiple angles simultaneously. But the most critical difference wasn't visible in blueprints or technical specifications. It was cultural. American damage control philosophy assumed that things would go wrong, that equipment would fail, that standard procedures wouldn't work, that improvisation would be necessary, that junior personnel might have to take charge if senior personnel were killed. American training prepared sailors for chaos. Japanese training prepared specialists to execute procedures. When chaos came, when the unexpected happened, when equipment failed and procedures didn't work, American crews adapted. Japanese crews struggled. None of this was obvious in December 1941 when Japanese carriers struck Pearl Harbor. The attack demonstrated Japanese excellence in planning, training, and execution. The Kido Butai, the mobile striking force built around 6 fleet carriers, had achieved complete tactical surprise. American battleships burned. Japanese losses were minimal. Naval theorists worldwide studied the raid as a masterpiece of carrier warfare. The Japanese went on to dominate the Pacific for 6 months. Their carriers struck Darwin, Australia in February 1942. They raided into the Indian Ocean in April, sinking the British carrier Hermes and the heavy cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire. Their aircraft were superior. Their pilots were more experienced. Their tactics were aggressive and effective. They had every reason for confidence. But they had never faced sustained damage. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 gave the first hint that Japanese damage control might have weaknesses. The carrier Shokaku took 3 bomb hits. She survived, but the damage forced her to return to Japan for repairs. She missed Midway. The Americans lost the Lexington to fuel vapor explosions, but they learned from it. Captain Frederick Sherman's after-action report detailed exactly what went wrong. The Navy studied those lessons. Changes were implemented across the fleet. Carbon dioxide purging of fuel lines. Better compartmentation of aviation fuel systems. Revised firefighting procedures. The Japanese had no equivalent process for capturing and disseminating lessons learned. Then came June 4, 1942. Midway. The battle that revealed just how fragile Japanese carriers were when they couldn't strike first. At 10:22 that morning, American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown surprised 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. The carriers had aircraft spotted on their flight decks, armed and fueled, ready to launch. Bombs and torpedoes had been brought up from magazines to rearm returning aircraft. The hangar decks were crowded. The Americans' timing was perfect. Bombs struck Akagi. Norman Dusty Kleiss, flying a Dauntless from Enterprise, watched his target explode. Kaga was undergoing a series of explosions that utterly eviscerated the ship, he reported, exposing her innards like some disemboweled animal. Soryu took 3 hits and was engulfed in flames within minutes. On all 3 carriers, the damage control response was immediate but ineffective. Specialist teams responded according to procedure. They fought fires. They attempted to contain flooding. But the explosions had damaged firefighting mains. Power failed. Communications were severed. The prepared plans didn't account for simultaneous catastrophic damage across multiple decks. And crucially, non-specialist crew members didn't have the training to improvise solutions. They waited for orders that never came. They couldn't adapt to chaos. Akagi's crew abandoned ship at 1350 hours. She remained afloat, burning, unable to fight the fires. Japanese destroyers scuttled her with torpedoes at 0200 the next morning. She had survived for more than 14 hours after being hit. But her crew couldn't save her. Kaga sank at 1925 on June 4th. Soryu sank at 1913. 3 fleet carriers lost. Not because Japanese engineering was inferior. Not because Japanese damage control equipment didn't work. But because the combination of doctrine, training, and design philosophy made them catastrophically vulnerable when damaged. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, survived the morning attack only to be caught in the afternoon by dive bombers from Enterprise. She took 4 bomb hits. Once again, fires spread rapidly. Once again, damage control efforts failed to contain them. She burned through the night. Her crew abandoned ship the next morning, and she sank. For fleet carriers lost in one day, the entire core of the Kido Butai destroyed. Japan would never recover from Midway. Not because she lacked industrial capacity, not because her pilots lacked skill, but because her carriers, magnificent as they were, couldn't absorb damage and survive. And in the months that followed, battle after battle, the pattern repeated. Japanese carriers would be hit, would burn, would sink. American carriers would be hit, would burn, and would fight on. The difference was never firepower. The difference was always damage control. The difference was always the men. But return to that afternoon on August 24th, 1942. The afternoon when the Enterprise took 3 bomb hits in 60 seconds. The afternoon when the Japanese expected her to burn and sink like their own carriers had at Midway. She didn't. At 17:14 and 30 seconds, the first bomb detonated. Lieutenant Commander Herschel Smith, the damage control officer, was already moving. He had trained his men for this. Every section had repair parties positioned and ready. Within seconds, men were racing toward the fires with hoses, foam, and portable pumps. The second bomb hit. Then the third. Fires erupted on 3 decks simultaneously. The flight deck buckled. The number 3 elevator was jammed halfway down. Twisted metal blocking access. Fuel lines ruptured. Electrical cables severed. Smoke filled compartments. Men screamed for help. The damage control parties did not wait for orders. They had trained for chaos. They knew their jobs. Repair Party 3 reached the fires on the second deck within 90 seconds of the first explosion. They found flames spreading through aviation spare parts storage. Magnesium flares were cooking off. The temperature was rising toward flashpoint. They dragged hoses through smoke so thick they couldn't see their own hands. They felt their way forward by touch. They found the fire. They attacked it with foam and water simultaneously, cooling burning metal while smothering flames. They worked in rotating shifts, 2 minutes at the fire, 30 seconds back for air, then back in. Repair Party 5 tackled flooding in compartments damaged by near misses. Seawater was pouring in through hull plates cracked by blast pressure. They shored bulkheads with timbers, stuffed mattresses into gaps, pumped water out faster than it came in. When one pump failed, they rigged another. When power failed, they ran emergency lines from undamaged compartments. They improvised. They adapted. They kept working. Electricians restored power to vital systems by rerouting cables through undamaged circuits. Damage control men patched the ruptured fuel lines and purged them with carbon dioxide to prevent vapor accumulation. Aviation mechanics cleared debris from around the jammed elevator and rigged block and tackle to manually raise it far enough to free trapped aircraft. Every man aboard Enterprise knew enough damage control to be useful. Cooks formed human chains passing equipment forward. Clerks operated pumps. Officers stripped to the waist and fought fires alongside enlisted men. There was no waiting for specialists. Everyone fought to save the ship. At 1812, less than 60 minutes after the first bomb hit, the fires were under control. At 2000 hours, the Enterprise was recovering aircraft. Her flight deck was cratered. Her elevator was jammed. She had a 10-foot hole blown in her side. But she was operational. She could launch and recover aircraft. She could fight. The Japanese pilots who attacked her reported that they had sunk or severely damaged an American carrier. They were wrong. The Enterprise had absorbed damage that would have destroyed any Japanese carrier and had continued operating. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The contrast became even more stark 2 months later at the Battle of Santa Cruz on October 26, 1942. By then, the Enterprise was the only operational American carrier in the Pacific. The Saratoga had been torpedoed and was under repair. The Wasp had been torpedoed and sunk. The Hornet was the only other carrier available. Against them, the Japanese deployed 4 carriers: Shokaku, Zuikaku, Junyo, and Zuho. The Americans were outnumbered 2-1 in carriers, vastly outnumbered in aircraft. The battle began at dawn. American and Japanese strike groups passed each other in the air, heading toward each other's carriers. The Hornet was hit first. Multiple bomb and torpedo hits within minutes. She burned furiously. Her damage control efforts failed. She would be abandoned and sunk. Then came the Enterprise's turn. Between 11:15 and 11:20, 24 Japanese dive bombers attacked. 2 bombs hit. A third near-miss opened seams in her hull below the waterline. The first bomb struck aft, penetrating the flight deck and exploding on the third deck. The blast killed 40 men instantly and started fires in multiple compartments. The second bomb hit forward, damaging the forward elevator and starting more fires. Once again, the damage control parties moved immediately. Once again, they fought fires in smoke-filled compartments. Once again, they shored bulkheads and patched hull plates and rerouted power. Once again, they kept the ship alive. But this time, they did more than that. At 12:21, just 66 minutes after being hit, the Enterprise recovered aircraft from her strike group. The forward elevator was damaged, but the aft elevator worked. The flight deck was cratered, but enough runway remained to land aircraft. Her crew had cleared enough wreckage, extinguished enough fires, and restored enough functionality that she could operate. Not at full capacity, not without risk, but she could fight. At 1400 hours, less than 3 hours after being bombed, the Enterprise launched a strike group against the Japanese carriers. Damaged, burning in places, with repair parties still fighting fires below decks, she launched aircraft. The Japanese could not believe it. Their pilots had reported hitting the American carrier multiple times. They had watched bombs explode on her deck. They had seen the smoke and fire. Yet here she was launching another strike. It seemed impossible. But it wasn't impossible. It was training. It was doctrine. It was the difference between treating damage control as a specialty and treating it as universal seamanship. The Enterprise survived Santa Cruz with 44 men killed and 75 wounded. She sailed to Noumea for emergency repairs, then to Pearl Harbor for more extensive work. By early December, she was back in action. She had been bombed, set on fire, flooded, and shot up twice in 3 months. She was still fighting. She would earn 20 battle stars by the end of the war, more than any other American warship. She would survive the entire conflict. But the same could not be said for Japanese carriers. On June 19, 1944, nearly 2 years after Midway, the Imperial Japanese Navy tried one more time to destroy American carrier forces. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, the largest carrier battle in history. 9 Japanese carriers against 15 American carriers. The Japanese had rebuilt their carrier fleet. They had new ships. They had trained new pilots. They had learned lessons. Or so they thought. The carrier Taiho was the pride of that rebuilt fleet. Commissioned on March 7, 1944, she was Japan's answer to everything that had gone wrong at Midway. She displaced 37,000 tons, making her the largest carrier Japan had ever built. She had an armored flight deck, the first Japanese carrier so equipped. She could theoretically withstand bomb hits that would have penetrated the wooden decks of earlier carriers. She had improved compartmentation. She had modern firefighting equipment. She represented everything Japanese naval architects had learned about building survivable carriers. Everything except the training to use it. At 08:10 on the morning of June 19th, the American submarine USS Albacore fired 6 torpedoes at the Taiho as she launched aircraft. One torpedo hit, striking the starboard side forward near the number 1 elevator. The explosion punched a hole in the hull. It cracked aviation fuel tanks beneath the elevator pit. Seawater and aviation gasoline mixed in the flooded elevator well. Fuel vapors began accumulating in enclosed spaces. The damage was serious but not immediately catastrophic. The Taiho maintained 26 knots. Her armored flight deck was undamaged. Her engines worked. Her steering responded. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the entire Japanese carrier force from Taiho's bridge, believed his flagship could survive. He was wrong. The damage control team made a decision. Aviation fuel vapors were accumulating in the forward part of the ship. The standard procedure for clearing dangerous vapors was ventilation. So they opened hatches. They activated the ship's mechanical ventilation system. They did exactly what their training told them to do. And they killed the ship. The ventilation system distributed fuel vapors throughout the carrier. The vapors spread from the damaged forward section to previously uncontaminated compartments. The enclosed hangar deck filled with explosive fumes. The living spaces filled with explosive fumes. The entire interior of the carrier became a bomb waiting for a spark. The crew smelled gasoline. They knew something was wrong, but they didn't know what to do. Their training had taught them to trust the ventilation system. Their training had taught them to follow procedures. Their training had not taught them to think like damage control men, to understand that the book answer might be the wrong answer, that sometimes you need to improvise. At 14:32, more than 6 hours after the torpedo hit, something created a spark. Nobody knows what. An electrical short. A tool striking metal. A damaged wire. It doesn't matter. The spark ignited the fuel vapors. The entire ship exploded from within. The armored flight deck, designed to withstand 1,000-pound bombs from above, buckled upward from the blast pressure below. The sides of the hangar deck blew out. Fire and smoke erupted from every opening. Men trapped below decks never had a chance. Those on the flight deck saw the deck lift beneath their feet, saw the deck plates separate, saw fire shooting up through the gaps. Admiral Ozawa transferred his flag to a cruiser. The Taiho listed to port, settled by the bow, and at 16:28, less than 4 hours after the explosion, she slid beneath the waves. 1,650 men died. The newest, most advanced, most heavily armored carrier Japan had ever built was destroyed by a single torpedo hit. Not because the torpedo inflicted fatal damage. Because the damage control response turned survivable damage into catastrophe. That same day, the submarine USS Kavala torpedoed the carrier Shokaku, the veteran of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea. She took 4 torpedo hits. She burned. Her damage control teams fought the fires according to procedure. They followed their training. They did everything they had been taught. It wasn't enough. Fuel vapor explosions tore through the ship. At 15:01, 9 hours after the first torpedo hit, she sank. 887 men died. 2 fleet carriers lost in one day. not to overwhelming force, not to superior American technology, to inadequate damage control. Compare this to the American experience. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the carrier USS Bunker Hill was hit by a kamikaze on May 11, 1945. The burning aircraft smashed through the flight deck. Its fuel-ignited aircraft spotted on the deck. Fire spread rapidly. Within minutes, 30 aircraft were burning. The carrier looked finished. The damage control parties went to work. They fought fires with foam and seawater. They jettisoned burning aircraft over the side. They purged fuel lines with carbon dioxide. They contained the fires to the flight deck and prevented them from spreading below. They saved the ship. Bunker Hill was out of action for weeks, but she survived. She returned to service. She made it home. The USS Franklin was hit by 2 bombs on March 19, 1945. The bombs detonated in the hangar deck when the ship was fully loaded with armed and fueled aircraft preparing for a strike. The explosions were catastrophic. The flight deck lifted 6 feet. Bulkheads collapsed. Fires erupted across the entire hangar bay. Aircraft ordnance cooked off. Rockets fired in random directions. Bombs exploded. The Franklin seemed doomed. 724 men died in the initial explosions. The fires burned so hot that steel twisted. But the damage control parties did not give up. They fought fires from positions that were untenable, where the heat was so intense that paint blistered on nearby bulkheads. They worked in teams, rotating every 2 minutes because that was all the human body could endure. They improvised firefighting systems when standard equipment failed. They manually threw burning ordnance overboard. They made hoses from whatever materials they could find. They worked for hours. The Franklin never lost power completely. Her engineering crew kept 1 boiler online. That 1 boiler provided enough steam to run pumps. Those pumps provided enough water pressure to fight fires. The ship didn't sink. She limped back to Pearl Harbor under her own power, listing heavily, her flight deck wrecked, but afloat. Her crew had saved her through sheer determination and training. These weren't isolated examples. American carriers absorbed punishment throughout the war. The USS Lexington at Coral Sea was lost, but only after fuel vapor explosions 6 hours after the battle. The crew had contained the initial damage. They had fought fires. They had nearly saved her. The USS Yorktown at Midway took 2 bomb hits and 1 torpedo hit. Her crew repaired damage from the bombs in 2 hours and got her underway again. She was abandoned only after a second Japanese submarine attack delivered 2 more torpedoes. Even then, she remained afloat for 2 days before finally sinking. Japanese carriers rarely lasted that long after comparable damage. The reason was simple but profound. American damage control was a system, not a department. It was a philosophy embedded in ship design, crew training, and operational doctrine. Every sailor knew basic firefighting, flooding control, and structural shoring. Every officer understood damage control principles. Every ship had multiple repair parties with overlapping responsibilities. If one party was wiped out, others could take over. If communications failed, parties acted independently. If standard procedures didn't work, crews improvised. The system assumed failure at every level and built in redundancy to compensate. Japanese damage control was different. It relied on specialists doing their jobs correctly. It assumed equipment would work as designed. It assumed communications would remain intact. It assumed that procedures would address every contingency. When those assumptions proved false, when equipment failed, when communications were severed, when procedures didn't apply, the system broke down. Specialists who were killed couldn't be replaced. Non-specialists didn't know how to help. Damage that should have been containable spread unchecked. This wasn't stupidity. This wasn't negligence. This was a fundamental difference in naval culture. The Japanese Navy had a tradition of emphasizing excellence in specialized roles. Their pilots were superbly trained. Their torpedo crews were the best in the world. Their gunnery was exceptional. But that emphasis on specialized excellence came at the cost of broadly distributed competence. American training emphasized acceptable proficiency across a wide range of skills. Every sailor was good at several things rather than excellent at one thing. In peacetime, this looked less impressive. Japanese carriers operated with more precision, more efficiency. American carriers were sloppier, slower, less elegant. But in combat, when things went wrong, when chaos ruled, broad competence beat narrow excellence every time. The numbers tell the story. During World War II, the United States lost 11 fleet and light carriers in combat or to accidents. 5 were sunk by aircraft, 4 by submarines, 2 by kamikazes. Japan lost 21 fleet and light carriers. 16 were sunk by aircraft or submarines. But the critical difference is survivability. American carriers often survived multiple hits. Japanese carriers rarely survived a single attack that penetrated their defenses. The USS Enterprise took 6 bomb hits during the war. She survived. The Taiho took 1 torpedo hit. She sank. The USS Franklin took 2 bombs and over 700 casualties. She survived. The Shokaku took 4 torpedoes. She sank. By 1945, the difference was overwhelming. American shipyards were producing Essex-class carriers at the rate of 1 every 6 weeks. Each Essex-class carrier incorporated lessons learned from combat. Improved compartmentation, better firefighting equipment, redundant systems, enhanced training programs. The ships got better with each iteration. Japanese shipyards were struggling to replace losses. They lacked materials. They lacked time. They lacked experienced workers. But even if they had built perfect carriers, they lacked the trained crews to man them effectively. The specialist system that had worked in 1941 couldn't scale to wartime needs. You can't train damage control specialists in weeks. You can train every sailor in basic damage control. America did. Japan didn't. That difference compounded over time. By the end of the war, some American sailors had been through multiple ship sinkings or heavy damage incidents. They had fought fires aboard carriers. They had patched holes in destroyers. They had kept cruisers afloat through sheer determination. Each experience taught lessons. Each survival refined techniques. The institutional knowledge grew. Meanwhile, Japanese sailors who survived one sinking rarely survived a second. The veterans died. The lessons died with them. Each new crew had to learn the same painful lessons from scratch. The USS Enterprise was decommissioned on February 17, 1947. She had survived the entire war. She had earned 20 battle stars. She had been recommended for the Congressional Medal of Honor, the only ship so honored. Congress never approved it. Politicians decided that ships couldn't receive the Medal of Honor. So the Enterprise received the Presidential Unit Citation instead. Her crew received the Navy Unit Commendation. She was the most decorated ship in the Navy. She had been hit by bombs 6 times, by kamikazes twice, by shell fragments countless times. She had never stopped fighting. In 1958, there was a movement to preserve her as a museum ship. The Navy refused. Preservation was expensive. The money wasn't available. In 1958, the Enterprise was sold for scrap. She was cut up and melted down. The ship that had saved the Pacific Fleet, that had fought at Midway and Guadalcanal and the Philippine Sea, that had absorbed punishment that would have sunk any Japanese carrier, ended her life in a scrapyard. Her crew protested. Veterans wrote letters. Congressional representatives asked questions. It made no difference. The Big E was gone, but what she represented survived. The damage control principles that kept her alive became standard throughout the Navy. Every carrier built after World War II incorporated lessons learned from Enterprise and her sisters. Every sailor who went through boot camp learned damage control. Every officer who graduated from Annapolis studied flooding control and firefighting and structural shoring. The system that saved Enterprise in 1942 is still saving American ships today. Different technology, different threats, same philosophy. Every man is a damage control man. Japan copied American carrier designs. They studied American technology. They analyzed American tactics. They built their own flat tops using knowledge gained from observing American practice. They got the hardware right, the engines, the catapults, the arresting gear, the anti-aircraft batteries, but they never fully grasped the software. the training, the culture, the philosophy that said damage control wasn't a department, it was seamanship, that said every sailor needed to know how to save his ship, that said improvisation mattered as much as procedure, that said keeping the ship afloat was everyone's job. And ship after ship, battle after battle, that difference killed them. Not immediately, not obviously, but inexorably. The Akagi burned at Midway. The Taiho exploded at the Philippine Sea. The Shinano, the largest carrier ever built by Japan, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull, sank after 4 torpedo hits from a single American submarine in November 1944. She had been in commission for 10 days. Her damage control equipment was state-of-the-art. Her watertight compartmentation was exceptional. But her crew hadn't trained together. They didn't know their equipment. They couldn't save her. The newest, largest, most modern carrier in the world sank on her maiden voyage because her crew didn't know how to fight for her survival. That's what Japan forgot when they copied American carriers. They forgot that the ship is just steel and machinery. The crew makes it live or die. Training makes the difference. Culture makes the difference. The philosophy that says every man fights, every man knows the basics, every man can help save the ship. That's what kept the Enterprise alive. That's what killed the Taiho. And that's the lesson that echoes across 8 decades. You can copy the design. You can replicate the technology. But if you don't copy the training, if you don't adopt the philosophy, if you don't build the culture, the ship won't survive when things go wrong. And in war, things always go wrong. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.